Empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. Shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men. Power Black men. Shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men to live extraordinary lives. Shatter the stereotypes. Shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men to live extraordinary lives.
Welcome to Shatter the Stereotypes, where the intention is to empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. This show is based on the simple idea that every Black man is capable of creating inner peace, dynamic health, great relationships, and financial abundance. Therefore, we provide insights and strategies to educate, motivate, and inspire Black men to reach their full potential and create the life of their dreams. So if you're ready for some high-octane motivation and inspiration that supports and empowers you to live the life you were born to live, get ready to shatter the stereotypes so you can build a life that lights you up and positively impacts the world. So now, let's shatter the stereotypes with your host, Coach Michael Taylor.
Hello and welcome to Shatter the Stereotypes, where the intention is to empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. You see, there's never been a shortage of Black male role models. There's only been a shortage of exposure of those role models on mainstream media. So my goal is to showcase and highlight Black men who are doing remarkable things in the world. And joining me today is a guy I recently met on Facebook, and I immediately knew that I wanted to feature him on the show. His name is Niles, and he's a guy who was definitely shattering stereotypes about Black men. He's a communication coach, a mindful storyteller, and the host of an amazing podcast called Stories of Awakening. So without further ado, let's welcome Calvin to the show. Calvin, how you doing today, my man?
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And yeah, thank you for your kind words.
Well, you know, I'm a firm believer. Nothing happens by accident. Everything happens for a reason. I believe our paths have crossed by divine synchronicity, if you will. So yeah. It is my absolute pleasure having you on the show. So before we jump into your work, though, let's just start off with a few icebreakers. So first of all, tell us where you're from.
I'm from the Caribbean originally. I live in London. I was born in a very tiny, beautiful island called Barbados. My mother is from Trinidad, which is 400 and something miles away. And that region is my sort of home, if you like. But I've lived in London for most of my life, basically. I'm on the west side of London, because London tends to be broken up into, you know, north, south, east, west, and everybody's got their own sort of microcultures. So I'm a West Londoner.
There you go. So name a woman who's inspired you to be who you are.
Oh, well, I mean, the really quick and easy answer is my mother, because she has instilled in a lot of principles in me, which I probably didn't even realize until I faced some of my own problems. And also she's been there as a rock through some of the most challenging times ever.
Yeah, good old mom. And now name a man that you look up to.
So many. Nelson Mandela, Jose Mujica, who used to be the Ecuadorian president. And I could even mention Desmond Tutu, who was very fortunately invited to his last birthday celebrations at the South African Embassy in London. And that was the last one. So,
wow.
So I have to say, yeah, these are really prominent figures.
Yeah. Now, if you were trapped on an island for 30 days and you could take only one book with you, what book would you take?
Tough. Probably The Survival's Guide to Surviving on an Island. But seeing that probably doesn't exist. One of my favorite books I always talk about is something called Letting Go by a man called David Hawkins.
Oh, yeah.
That book changed my life. So, yeah, as soon as I start to get worried about, oh my God, am I going to get off of this island or am I going to make it? I'll just go back to that book and be like, okay, I can let that go now.
Yeah. Definitely one of my favorites also. He's
Oh,
also, what was it? What was the other book he wrote? Power of
Power versus Force.
versus Force. Yeah, Power versus Force. Yeah, that book was pivotal in my transformation. His
Yeah.
whole consciousness scale just kind of made things make sense to me.
Me too. Yeah.
Understanding, I said, oh, that energy, that level, that makes sense. So yeah, really, really, really enjoyed that. Now, you like movies?
Totally.
Name a movie that you like.
Lord of the Rings, Matrix,
Ah, you seen the new one?
Resurrections. No, not yet.
Okay.
I decided that before I even watch that, I need to go and just redo every single one, all the
Yeah.
ones that came out before, back to back, and I just have to create the time for that.
Yeah, they really tied the story together for me. A lot of people are going to try to say, was it better than the first one? Or, to me, it's like a continuation of a story,
Hmm.
and they kind of tied it all together with this new one. So I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So if I gave you a magic wand and you
Hmm.
could create anything your heart desired, what would your life look like 10 years from now?
Hmm. It's a really good question. Well, 10 years from now, I would probably be moving around the world. I would probably be doing talks about the themes of the books that I write. Um, that journey is a very young one at the moment, so I think I've got a lot of writing to do. um, and yeah, we'll probably have my family in tow somewhere in that whole experience.
There you go. There you go. So, as a man who happens to be Black,
Yeah.
are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future in general? Where do you fall on that spectrum between optimism and pessimism for the future?
Always, always, always optimism. I mean, that's not going to surprise you, Michael, that's for sure. um, but yeah, I mean, it's partly conditioning. I've been very fortunate to be born into an environment and a family who are, I guess, biased towards optimism. So that's conditioned me with a certain outlook. But I also happen to see that, the more optimistic we are, the more benefits or value we find from even the challenging and darkest experiences are serving us in some way if we just have that perspective. So definitely optimism 100% all the way. It's not to say, by the way, that things don't go wrong or challenge me,
Right.
but I will always be on balance, be optimistic about the future.
My friends gave me a nickname. They call me Michael Happy Ass Taylor.
that's a good one.
Yeah, Michael Happy Ass Taylor. They always tell me, Michael, you and your happy ass. It's just
It's
part of
true though. It's so true. Something really funny is like nicknames never stuck with me for some reason. People have tried to give me nicknames for many, many, many years, and I've worked all kinds of different jobs, Michael. I dropped out of college to train to be an airline pilot, and that went askew with different challenges and marriage and children and family. Then I worked in the railways. I drove trains. I flew planes. I went into corporate development. I did all kinds of things in the background before I finally stepped into my actual zone of genius. And those were environments where everybody had a nickname. Do you know, like, where the guys are just like, everybody's got a terrible nickname as well. Some of the things I would not even want to say on your show. And they tried to get nicknames to stick with me for about 10 good years. None of them ever stuck. And I still haven't figured out why to this day.
All right. So I wrote a book titled The Cure for Onlyness, a Black Man's Guide to Joy, Passion, and Purpose. And in the book, I talked about the challenges that we as Black men sometimes go through when we are in environments in which we're the only person of color. So living in London, I'm sure you've had that experience. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I would have to contextualize this by saying, my experience in London as a Black man varies from, say, somebody who was probably born and raised in London. Um, And the reason I'm mentioning that, making that distinction right now, is because coming from the Caribbean, everybody was black where I was from.
Yeah.
I went to school, the prime minister was black, the head teacher was black, the businessman was black, everybody was black. 99% of the population was black. So I didn't have, and I say this with a degree of caution, I didn't have the direct exposure to inferiority
Makes
the
sense.
same way that other European cultures or European dominant cultures might have had. So actually, there was a lot of things that I didn't see, and a lot of obstacles that I was not aware of. And in some ways, you can describe that as ignorance. But in other ways, it helped me because I was able to do things that other black folks were like, how did you do that? Why did you just crossed that boundary? You just crossed that line. I'll give you a quick example, right? A little quick mini story. I was in South Africa in 2020. I was doing a friend's wedding and it was a great time. And we were in this really remote lodge, which was gorgeous. I mean, I'd never seen the night sky from the Southern Hemisphere. It was pitch black. There are hyenas, crying at night. And it was just amazing, magical experience. And I happened to be in a lodge where most of the visitors and all the friends in the wedding party, they were all Europeans. My friend was a white English guy, one of my best friends of all, and his family were from Portugal. His wife's family were from Portugal. So, but there were staff there. And the staff were black, from locals. And I remember drinking in the bar one night, and I said to some of the staff there, I said, there was two ladies from reception. I said, "You're going to join us after the wedding for some drinks in the bar?" And they're like, yeah, we'll come and see you. And they didn't. And there was this invisible boundary there between the black staff and the white staff. The white staff were there. They were drinking in the bar. But the black staff, they didn't really want to come. And I was really, really surprised that subtle thing, which was so normal, they probably didn't even perceive it there.
Right.
But for me, I was like, what? So they're looking at me and they're thinking, this black guy. And I actually happened to do the wedding ceremony for my friend and, do all the pronouncements and everything. You may, bring the ring and all this. And it was so beautiful and magical. And I can only imagine that they were thinking, what was this guy doing? Was he on some sort of source, magic powers or whatever? How could he just cross over to this imaginary boundary?
Yeah.
So that imaginary boundary translates in all different cultures, right? In all different settings. And when I came to London as a young teenager, I just didn't perceive them the same way because the social construct didn't tell me that boundary was there. I just felt empowered to be just a person. And I think that served me well in some ways. On balance, being an optimist, I think it served me better than the cost of it was. But of course, I still had to learn. That there are real boundaries there too.
Now, living in America, obviously, we are constantly bombarded with negative images of Black men. So generally speaking, I'm curious, how are Black men portrayed in London? I mean, in the media, what's the story like there? Storylines there?
Yeah. Well, again, I just want to preface it by saying, everything is very much determined by my own experience. And I have not really seen any huge problems compared to some of the stuff that I know that's happened in the past. My parents met in London in the 60s. My father was a bus conductor before all the islands in Caribbean started to go independent from England. They moved here as subjects of the crown. They were subjects, that's what they were called. And they were entitled to move here after the war. So my parents met here, who were from different islands, who probably would never have met otherwise, came here and met in this community in the 60s, which brought together all these different peoples from the Caribbean. My dad got spat at when he was working on the buses. My mother got called all kinds of names when she worked in the healthcare. So for me, I bear that in mind when I'm walking around and living in London in today's age, and have young Black sons who also do. And I say, bear in mind that actually, things are pretty damn good. Having said that, people still put you in boxes. That still happens. I still catch people by surprise, for example, if they see me doing something that they think, well, that's only the domain of, the stereotypical view. I'll give you a very funny story, right? I had a friend about 15, maybe more than 15 years now. I was in college, so 20 something years ago. Me and a friend of mine, we wanted to start this fish tank business. So eBay was like this new thing, it was burgeoning, and it was like a cool way to buy stuff. And if you're fortunate enough to have an account, we could buy things. So we bought some fish tank supplies from a guy who was like a big fish keeper. And we went. It was London. It wasn't even like London is a cosmopolitan city, right? So it's not like we went out into the sticks and there was no Black folks for miles and miles around. There's all kinds of cultures in this city. In fact, pretty much almost everyone in the world you might find here. And we went to collect this thing, and the guy was hesitant to open the door. And he finally opened the door. He said, "Are you here for the fish tank and the associated equipment?" And we said, "Yeah." And he went, "You don't look like fish guys." And we went, "Whoa, what do fish guys look like?" Right. So these kind of expectations that you are either a sports person or a musician, all that stereotypical stuff.
Sure.
You're not going to climb high into the corporate space and become a corporate leader. If you're seen in the store, you're either playing the piano or a cleaner.
Yeah.
So there's stuff like that. I mean, just tell you one thing quickly. There was one funny occasion where there was a time when people wouldn't get jobs in bars, pubs being a big English culture. And especially if you're a minority and you had a different name. So if you had an African name or an Indian name or something like that, you wouldn't even get an interview. But of course, a lot of Blacks have English names or anglicized names. So you might get there and then they'd be like, "Oh, I didn't realize you were Black." So you do get little things like that. But having said that, I think a lot of progress has been made, and there's still a lot more to be made. But I think it's important to, if I recognize, what my parents have been through, that we've come a long way, and they suffered a lot as actually to enable that.
Yeah. And again, that's the whole intention of this show, is to shatter stereotypes, especially as Black men, because we have a unique situation, to say the least. I know, especially here in America, I have been, accused of being a sellout by Black people because of some of the choices that I've made. I've been rejected by white people simply because of the color of my skin. So you have to kind of navigate that. And the way to do that, I believe, is first and foremost is to know who you really are, and just be comfortable in who you are as a human being. And then you can kind of navigate through those spaces. But I think it's really important to, we hear it all the time, representation matters. There's an organization here in America called 100 Black Men, and it's a really positive, powerful organization for Black men. And their slogan is, "What they see is what they'll be." And so it's important to expose Black men to other ways of seeing themselves and the world around them. And that's the whole intention of this show. So that's why I really love doing it, just exposing men of color who are doing remarkable things in the world. So I'm curious though.
Yeah.
In the work that you and I do, let's call it coaching, consciousness, spirituality, whatever you want to call it. I know that there is here in America a lot of resistance because collectively speaking, Black folks are probably the most religious group in this country, And so there's some hesitancy, rejection, fear around talking about spirituality without talking about Jesus or without talking about religion. So I'm curious, within your scope, let's just say, just a general number of how many Black men are you in conversations with about consciousness and the stuff that you talk about?
Yeah. That's a good question. A handful, I would say.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I've got people in my very near circle who, you can talk to them about anything. Um, but I would say by and large, yeah, you're right. It's few and far in between.
Yeah. And that's why I do this show, because we need more exposure. We need to be willing to, I like to think of it as going deep, being
Mm,
willing to look within, to really challenge ourselves as human beings. Because I get a lot of pushback from saying this, but it is what I believe.
mm,
Sometimes as Black men, we put so much emphasis on being Black that we don't understand or recognize our humanness. And I've
yeah,
been accused of denying, racism exists and all of that by saying that.
yeah,
But I hold firm to the belief that I am a man who happens to be Black.
yeah,
And I love my ethnicity, no shame in it, but I recognize that it is not the source of my creativity, of my power, of my passion. My passion comes from my soul, from my heart. So it's an it's a unique conversation to have with some Black folk, because they're like, "What?
yeah, yeah,
What are you talking about?"
yeah.
Oh,
It's a good point because I actually remember I was speaking to my dad's in his 80s now, and last year I was with him in the Caribbean, and one of his old friends from way back in the day, who's also, of course, in his 80s. And we were having this conversation, and he's like, yeah, and the Jamaicans and the Trinidadians and the Barbadians, and calling all these islands and saying that we did this and we did that. And if it wasn't for this, and if it wasn't for that. And I thought it was very fascinating because, this sense of identity, what does a person hold on to determine who they are, right? So invariably there'll be things people call out, and they'll say, oh yeah, well, it's where you live, your geography. Okay, so geographically, okay, that's what help makes you who you are. Okay, what else makes you who you are? Well, it's your race, of course it's your race, and then it's your sexuality, and then it's then your culture. What goes into your culture? What's what you eat, and so on and so on and so on. Oh, well, that's really interesting. um Ackee and saltfish. It's this Jamaican dish, and it's the national dish. So do you know where ackee and saltfish originated? Well, it's a Jamaican dish. Well, okay, but well, saltfish. What is saltfish? Well, it's cod normally. It should be cod. So where does cod come from? Well, cod comes from, it's a cold water fish, right? Yeah. So it's not from around here. Oh, oh, right. Okay. It's from Europe, isn't it? Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Cool. Where does ackee come from? Well, it grows on the trees outside. Yeah, but where's it originally come from? Well, of course, Africans brought that over to the West from Africa, and the Ghanaians used to actually call it ake, and that was the original sound. So this dish was created from these disparate supposed cultures, which are which have now helped to reinforce a sense of identity around what makes a person who they are. So I think it's always helpful to ask that question. Well, who are you? Who are you? And what is it that determines who you are? And soon, when you start to unpick it in a really trivial example around food, you start to see that that doesn't really have any solidity. It's not
yeah,
firm. As soon
right.
as you dig a little bit more, you realize, well, that's actually not a fixed thing, because that came from here and that came from here. Okay, so that's not me. Suddenly, that sense of identity being fixed loosens its grip, and that's where I think the freedom of mind comes from, around putting oneself in a box, whether that's your own blackness or your own region or your own language. And that's not to say, in my opinion anyway, that richness and diversity and beauty that comes from our backgrounds, wherever they may be, is not a wonderful thing to marvel at and value and love. But as soon as we put it as a build prison bars out of it, if you want to say that, then it's problematic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah.
I know when I say, you know, I am a man who happens to be Black versus just a Black man, I know I think a lot of the feelings that some Black men get is that I'm denying my ethnicity by saying that. And the fact is, I'm not denying my ethnicity, I'm actually affirming my humanity. And it's a real challenging conversation sometimes to have as a man who happens to be Black. And so in this conversation, in this shadow the stereotype conversation, is something that, you know, I bring up occasionally, and I say, look, how do you see yourself? Do you see
Yeah,
yourself?
yeah.
Do you see yourself as a Black man, or do you see yourself as a man who happens to be Black? And there's a distinction to be made there. So, because I try not to get too attached to labels,
Yeah.
because I know I'm much deeper than that. And so that's just part of my mission, is to engage men in a conversation about who they are. So with that being said, Mr. Calvin, now I'd like you to introduce yourself to the audience, tell them what you do professionally and whatever you want to put out there about who is Calvin Niles.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I forgot I hadn't introduced myself. We got so far into the conversation. Yeah, what time is it? Well, my name is Calvin Niles, as you know. I call myself the mindful storyteller because I combine mindfulness and storytelling. Storytelling is a way to help us weave together and create narratives of the experience of our lives. Invariably, humans can't escape it. But mindfulness is all about developing awareness. And I find that with mindfulness, we're able to develop awareness, not just of, anything, but specifically in the context of what I do, is developing awareness of the stories that we tell. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell the world. And then we'll see that so much of our interpretation of reality is based on story. So I call myself the mindful storyteller for that reason. I also write. I've written my first novel. I've published a number of biographical stories, and I've written on mindful communication in a book with a number of other mindfulness teachers called Mindfulness for Challenging Times. So those are my main areas of activity. But who I am is just a human being on a growth journey, trying to do better and reach my potential. And that's it.
There you go. Now, you also do coaching?
Yeah. So I coach people in the storytelling.
Okay.
I coach them. I do mindful communication coaching. I do storytelling coaching specifically for people who want to create their signature story and bring that consciousness to it. So those are my fundamental focus areas of coaching. But of course, I also do storytelling training, which is kind of a strategic part of my activity. And I do that with companies here in the UK, particularly charities, very big charities over here. Very popular charities are my sort of client roster, if you like. I don't think many people in the US would have heard of them, but they're really well-loved charities who focus on hospice care, who focused on helping empower people with learning disabilities, getting people back into work, social mobility, things like that.
Mm. Now, I try to watch trends. As an entrepreneur, I'm always looking for trends. And from a human standpoint, I'm also seeing some trends. And one of the biggest trends is this whole coaching industry. It's amazing how the last 5 years or so, everybody's a coach. So everybody, here in America, they use the term the Great Resignation, where people are leaving their jobs, some of them as a result of COVID and being laid off. But
I've never heard that. Great Resignation. That's a good little label there.
Yeah, that's a big buzzword right now. Right. That resignation. But see, for me, in a spiritual context, it is my belief that as human beings, we are still evolving. And I believe that we're waking up, if you will, waking up in consciousness. And so when I see these trends and I see this coaching industry, when I first started writing, back in the 90s, there were very few Black men even having these types of conversations about spirituality and relationships and emotions and all of that. And now, as I look, man, there are a dime a dozen now, which is a good thing, I believe. But I think, again, what's been missing is this whole idea of what you just said, which is sharing and telling our stories, and how sharing and telling our stories can help uplift others and can give them exposure to, number one, gaining the courage to share their stories, the courage to know that their stories can actually benefit someone else. So can you talk to us a little bit about the power, the power of sharing stories?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, first and foremost is that, you know, everything that we do in the world on the physical level is involving a story. The conversation that we're having now, in order to weave a narrative together, the story mind is active. And the reason we need that is because it helps us to create meaning and it helps us to contextualize experiences. Otherwise, everything is just random. So to create meaning and create context, we weave a story narrative. And there can be a million or an infinite number of stories for any given event. So stories are really important to help us. They are probably one of the oldest forms of human technology in terms of what makes us human, you know, what separates us from the animal kingdom. And we have our prefrontal cortex evolution, and we have this part of us, which, you know, not talking about our spirits or souls or anything like that, but literally just the physical nature of our evolution means we have this part of our brain that allows us to create this kind of meaning. So stories are important for that. They've been around from time immemorial. You know, I don't know if you know some of the ancient fables that we've been telling. Say more than 5,000 years ago, the ancient tablets of the stories, which essentially chart journeys of mankind through time, the ancient myths, and then of course we moved into the old painted stories of the caves of Indonesia and France. The Chauvet cave would have supposedly depicted the most old story in France of mankind, until they discovered at the beginning of 2021 one in Indonesia, which is closer to 50,000 years old. So stories have been around for a long time. Why it's important that we share them is it's one of the most effective ways to implant directly into somebody else's mind someone's experience. If I tell you I went downstairs and it rained and I got wet, this is, you know, that's in itself a story, but you don't really know how I feel. And what was helpful in the narrative is it helps us to translate some of that to make meaning out of it for ourselves as the receiver. And there's huge amount of research out there that proves that we experience somebody else's story, literally biologically experience somebody else's story. And actually I was doing some research the other day into, because in my book club, our theme of the month is gratitude. And gratitude, I was doing a review of all the gratitude research that's been done up until modern times. And interestingly, I found out from a famous a neuroscientist and researcher and professor at Stanford over there in the US, a man called Andrew Huberman. He was saying that actually, believe it or not, we've talked about gratitude lists and creating lists. We talked about thanking other people, and not to decry that and say it's not important. These are one of the most powerful ways of experiencing the benefits, at least neurologically, of gratitude practice is by watching or listening to a story of some kind act being done. And the research is backing this up, that parts of the brain are being stimulated so powerfully that has more potential to rewire neurocircuitry than any of the other practices that we've been told are important. So what I'm saying here is that these stories are helping us in so many ways that we don't really even know all of them right now. But one thing I always take a moment to also preface it or contextualize it and say, put it in a container, is that they are still stories. and they mustn't, you know, it's double-edged sword, right? The story can also be an inhibitor. It can also be a tether and prevent us from really soaring if we get too attached to them. So there's a fine art here of using the story's potential to share, to inspire, to get people to understand, but to also not be so attached to it that it becomes constraining, like we talked about with the identity earlier. So it's a fine balancing act, but I wouldn't have been in the business of helping people tell stories, find stories, rewrite stories, use stories for transformation if I didn't value the power of them, despite the limitation as well.
Yeah, if you think about organized religion, really, organized religion is just a series of stories shared and passed down for generation to generation. And the question becomes, do we accept, believe the stories? Because when we expose ourselves to different stories, we can change our inner narratives about the reality that we're experiencing. And so I love the idea of storytelling, because for me, storytelling gets to the heart versus just sharing information, which just kind of keeps us stuck in our heads. And so when I listen to or hear a story, it's like there's this instant connection that I can feel, not just think. So I think it's really important. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with Joseph Campbell's hero's journey.
The absolutely.
12 stages of the hero's journey. So for those of you who have not heard of his hero's journey, be sure and Google it. It's called The Hero's Journey, and there's 12 stages to it. It's really powerful story. But in the story, he coined the term the monomyth, saying that basically all stories are the same story. It's this 12 stages that we all go through as human beings. And I think it's important for us to understand how that hero's journey works, and it's all tied into story and storytelling.
So can I just say something about that? Actually, it's really, really powerful. I mean, one of the things in the mindful storytelling that I'm doing is I'm working with a very good friend of mine, author of Mindfulness for Dummies. He also taught me to teach secular mindfulness, Shamash Aladina. We've sort of teamed up and created a tool for coaches and therapists to use in their work, mindful storytelling, and how to use it for transformation using the hero's journey. So those steps, and I mean, what's really interesting is when Joseph Campbell did it, of course, he did all this analysis, and it's a collection of essays, and he originally came up with something like 17 stages of the hero's journey or something like that. Hollywood actually has to take the credit for distilling it, specifically a man called Vogler, who's distilled it to 12 steps. And it's really easy to grasp mentally. And it's very clear, it charts out a clear pathway for the more modern way of storytelling, because of Joseph Campbell's academic prowess, 2, the time that it was written. It probably would be a little bit difficult. For example, he's got something in there about meeting the goddess, right? And modern people would be like, well, does it have to be a goddess? You raise very masculine view, very misogynistic kind of, but he wrote it at a certain time in history. So there are things like that that have been distilled out. And what's really powerful about it is that that's one way of really looking at stages of your life, as you talk about the monomyth, and saying that this is my life, your life is my life. Hold a minute. So I'm not that guy. I'm not Calvin Niles, that black guy from the Caribbean who lived in London anymore. I'm also you, and you, and you, and you, and you. So we have this common story, which we can use to identify these stages and actually help us to pivot and transform and become more self-empowered. So that I just wanted to share that part, because the part of the mindful storytelling is that we can go into each stage of your life. You can self-identify, of course. And we've done this. Shamash and I have done this in workshops where people have literally right before us come out and said, I had never seen my life that way until now. And that's just because we were able to just go into one part and say, okay, when you were crossing the threshold, one of the stages of the journey, what did you experience? What did you feel? Who do you need to help you get over that threshold? And that person is your mentor. Who is that? Are they alive? Are they dead? Is it a book? You've asked me a lot of these questions already in this 10-minute conversation. And then people start to see, oh my God, I didn't realize I had so many resources available to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And so again, that one of my favorite sayings is, if you don't go within, you will always go without. And so being willing to go within, especially as men who happen to be Black, I believe that the greatest challenge we have is to begin that inner journey, to wake up to who we truly are as human beings. And storytelling is a great way to do that. It kind of helps us do it without being too analytical, but it cuts through the intellect and gets to the heart. That's what I love about storytelling. And I personally just love story. I love movies because movies are just metaphors for life, you know,
Yeah.
but they're just stories, right? And so we get to give meaning to the stories that we watch, right?
Yeah.
So with that being said, though, I have come to know there are only two things that will cause a person to want to change. One is pain, and the other is what I call divine discontent, which is just that inner knowing, that inner feeling that something's just off with our lives. So I'm curious, what triggered you to begin your spiritual journey? Was it pain, or was it that divine discontent?
Wow. Yeah, it's a great question. I would say, well, first of all, I have to again say I'm really like super thankful and lucky that I grew up in a family which already had some degree of awareness. You know, my mother is, as you mentioned earlier in your own experience, because I was very fortunate enough to start reading your latest book, Whether Jesus Was a Coach. And I think you mentioned unity in there, didn't you?
Yes.
Well, my mother actually trained in unity in the 70s in Kansas.
Oh, wow.
And she left in the 80s, but after she left, she set up a metaphysical bookstore, moved back to the Caribbean, set up a metaphysical bookstore, and out of that had a number of groups that she would attend, including forming her own spiritual group. So I guess I was very fortunate that I had a family, three other siblings, who grew up with me in an environment that was favorable to some kind of spiritual awareness. Meditation practice was not unusual, things like that. However, I think it's kind of like, you ever had when you were a kid, your parents or somebody who was caring for you put something in your pocket without you knowing?
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, my mom packed this for me. I didn't even know. You get to school, you're like, oh my God, I have this in my bag on my lunchbox. For me, I would say if it's probably a little bit like that, where all these things are getting packed in your bag for your life journey. You don't really know, but it's the pain that allows you to discover that. So, so I've been through this kind of journey of, you know, always looking for something, you know, like I mentioned, you know, I dropped out of university. Then I dropped out of university and I said, what did I was? I remember when I was young, I wanted to fly planes. I went and trained to be an airline pilot. I never actually completely finished, but I did all my professional exams. I did my hour billing, I spent a ton of money. And then that eventually came to this crossroads. And then I said, okay, well, look, you know, I need to be able to pay the bills by the time I'd met my wife and we had the house and the kids. And so I got this job, and that's when I moved on to trains. Then I was driving the trains, but I still had this kind of, like you say, discontent. I didn't really know it was divine discontent. I'm actually going to digest that as I come off this conversation, because maybe that's a contributing factor. But of course, then we get the hit with the challenges in life. And then for me, it was the pain of the family breakdown and so on, which, and I used to call it breakdown, but it really is a change in the structure or my idea of what a family relationship should look like, because it's not really broken. I mean, we're still a whole family. It's just a very different setup to what it would have been. But the pain of that reality shattering is what caused me to go into that bag and go, right, what do I actually have here that I can use? And then I started to realize there were these tools that I was already carrying. I didn't really know how to use them, how to apply them. And that's when the work really started. That's when the application of the tool set to the problems I was facing really started. And it comes with a lot of difficult choices, and courage too, because it's very easy to run from pain, very easy to do that, very easy to hide from the painful experience or to put a plaster on it. And I had my fair share of that, heavy drinking, doing things like this. And when I say heavy drinking, is one of those ones that creeped up on you because I was in a job. I was in a good corporate job. I wasn't, destitute under a bridge. But every day after work, I would be drinking every single day without fail. Then it got earlier and earlier and earlier until it was 7 days a week. And before I knew it, I even was one stage, I got to a point where I basically had a meltdown in this bar in London, a pub. And because the woman wanted to stop serving and I wasn't happy about it. But I'd been drinking all day. And that was a huge turning point for me when I realized something just slapped me and said, you need to change. And that, I think, was part of the running. So being able to face requires courage, knowing that you have tools available. If you haven't, you got to build them, create them, source them. But I was fortunate I already had some to get going, something to start with.
Yeah.
And then that courage helped me. So I would say it's probably a combination of, the divine discontent, which I really like that phrase, and the pain. And then the courage then to just to walk that journey, to face it, to approach it, to say, what is this teaching me? Where is the opportunity here? There's only two ways: grow or shrink.
Yeah. And I think, again, speaking from a Black male perspective, I think it's important for us, number one, to share our stories and talk about the pain, talk about the divine discontent, so it will wake up something in someone else who may be watching this right now. Because I know after my divorce, I had sunk into this really deep depression, which I didn't even recognize as depression. But I just knew that I had gotten to a point in my life where I just wanted to check out. It just felt like everything I had done didn't work. And, I had always been successful, if you will. And my divorce was the first time that I'd ever really failed at something really big. And it broke me. It really did, because it wasn't the fact, the divorce and the person I was with, it was the fact that I had failed that it crushed me, because I I was always go get them and, successful. And so I like to call it my divine wake-up call, because I do believe the universe is perfect. I do believe that there is a divine plan in place. And sometimes when we are in alignment with the divine plan of our lives, the universe has to take drastic measures to get our attention. And I like to think of my divorce as my divine wake-up call. It was that divine slap upside the head from the universe that said, look, you're not doing what you were put on this planet to do. Unfortunately, since you're not listening, I've got to do something to get your attention. Boom, divorce, failure, depression, homelessness. But now, in retrospect, I can see just how perfect it all was. The perfection of it just boggles my mind, because in retrospect, I can see that the loving presence, which I choose to call divine intelligence, it had been nudging me since I was a kid to be an entrepreneur, to not work for somebody else, to do my own thing, to express my own truth.
Yeah.
And since I wasn't listening, the universe said, damn it, you've got a bigger game to play. So let's do this. And so that's how my journey began. And it was a lot of pain. But the joy that I feel now, all the pain was worth it. It was absolutely worth it. So let's actually, let me ask you this question. How would you define God?
Yeah, I've heard a number of terms used to describe him, and people would say things like the source. People would say things like the universe, the law of nature, all these things. I would probably be inclined to go along with the source and the universe and that kind of thing. But the universe carries a very fluid interpretation. And I actually think that's fine, because we can certainly say it's not a man in the sky. I would be happy enough to say, he's not a man in the sky, or, any kind of personification. However, can I actually say what God is? It would be hard for me to be able to do that. I don't know, actually, but I would say I'm probably closer to, this idea that, what I've sort of extracted from the learning, from some of the other teachers out there who've gone before us in millennia gone by and are still there now, is that even beyond this material reality, underneath this quantum reality of energy waveform, is nothing. And I like to listen from time to time to the Book of the Way, Lao Tzu. And Lao Tzu talks about, there being at the center of darkness, beyond darkness. Nothing there.
Yeah.
And I feel like the source out of which all things arise, including energy, would be my best guess as to what what God is.
Yeah. Now, are you familiar with Neil Donald Walsh?
I'm not. I haven't read any of the work, but I've or participated in any of the. I think it was some teachings there as well, some courses there as well that I think I've heard of before, based on his work. But no, I don't know him very well.
Yeah, his claim to fame was a book called Conversations with God. And it was one of the books that really just confirmed and validated my truth about God. Well, he's wrote probably 30 books, but his latest book is called Pure Love. And in the book, he talks about, from a quantum level, how everything basically boils down to nothingness. But he said, the best way I can describe it is that nothingness is pure love. Mm-hmm. It is the origin of everything. And he said, even the word pure love can't really touch what it is. But that's as close as I can get to describing what it is. Pure love. And I really resonated with that, because like yourself, I love looking at it from a scientific perspective, from a quantum perspective. But that pure love really resonated with me when he said it and how he put it. Matter of fact, I talk about that in my latest book, that God is pure love. Now, when I speak about God, I like the term divine intelligence. That's just something that just kind of resonates with me. Divine intelligence that orchestrates this whole universe, and it just sort of feels right.
Yeah.
So
that's a nice way of putting it, and I could definitely go along with that too.
Yeah. So with that being said, we're going to switch gears here a little bit, and I want to play a little clip.
Okay.
Let's see. Let me get this up real quick. Here we go.
I understand if you want to cry, but you won't be here forever. A new moment always arrives. Think of it like the changing weather. If it never rained, how would the flowers bloom? See yourself as that flower and your pain as your food. Then, when the sun returns, you open your heart to its rays, allowing the beams of love in, and sharing your beauty for all in your space. You aren't trying to make anyone happy, but you just do. It's your way of being, not doing. It's just the result of you being you. And if it never rained, then your radiance couldn't shine through. Do you see how pain can be the thing that helps you to see the truth? Cease your struggle. Let each flow through you like a stream. Allow joy and pain, the sun and the rain, to wake you up from your illusory dream.
Love, 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 love it. Oh my gosh, do I love that. Okay, so first of all, I got to tell you, you have the most incredible soothing voice. It's kind of got that, it's got that Morgan Freeman kind of, ooh, it just feels warm, feels warm and was fuzzy, man. That was just amazing. But tell us a little bit about that poem. I love that poem.
Yeah. Thank you so much for playing that. Yeah, it was a nice surprise. That poem was inspired by the fact that so much of our suffering is because we are resisting things. And one of the things that's really popular in London, in the UK, in England, is rain. But yet no one likes it. And it's always crying and grasping for the sun. Can't wait for the sun to come out. Can't wait for the spring to be here. Can't wait for this sky to be blue, so on and so on. And it's lovely, but we have also conditioned ourselves to not accept what is actually here and now. And so I just found that really a nice title to explain that we are suffering as humans so much because we refuse to accept what is present, even the pain. So in there I mentioned, the sun, the rain, the joy, and the pain, because if we allow them both, then we are free from our relentless running away from the pain. As I mentioned earlier about my own experience too, of really not wanting to experience the pain. And we can also experience the joy and the sun and the blue skies and love that too, without holding on too tightly to it. So that's one of the fundamental teachings of mindfulness, actually, which is we don't need to cling on to anything and we don't need to run away from anything. Some people call it, attachment and aversion, clinging and aversion, but really it's just fundamentally allowing to be what is there to be. And then what happens is the fruits come even without you having to really work too hard. All the work is in just letting go, really. And so that's what inspired that poem for me.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful. Now, do you do all your own editing and so forth with the images and stuff?
Yeah, I enjoy doing that. I mean, if I have a whole load of kind of video stuff to do, I'll have somebody help me with that. But in terms of my poems, I create them all myself because I enjoy the process. I actually enjoy writing them. I'll wake up first thing in the morning, and that's when I'll write a poem. They tend to come spontaneously, but especially in the morning, even before I get out of bed, I'll just wake up in the morning, and then I'll just grab a pen and I will just write the poem there and then, and it's done within 5 minutes. And then I'll just make a video. And I enjoy that. I do enjoy that. Yeah. It's just pure pleasure.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a moment, because I think it's a powerful thing, because I myself get so many ideas immediately when I wake up. And what I usually do is I keep my phone next to my bed and I make notes on my
Yeah.
phone, and then I email them to myself. So because thoughts will just kind of come, and I use the term emergent.
Yeah.
So I'll be laying there, and then I'll get this idea. For example, I love writing books, and so I'll wake up and I might have an idea for a title of a book. Like my next book is called "I'm Not Okay with Gray," and I talk about how to create an extraordinary life after 50. And when the idea hit me that morning, I thought, wow, that's a cool title for a book.
Yeah, it is.
and so, and so I made a little note, sent it to myself. I'm not okay with gray. And so when I do that, I have this really amazing process that when I come up with a title, I'll hire a person to create a book cover design. And then once I have this visual, I just start listening, and I'll start getting ideas for chapters. Boom, I'll come up with the chapters. I'll create a folder on my computer for the chapters. And then throughout the year, when I find an article or something that inspires me, I'll drop it in a little folder. I said, that could go into this chapter, so boom, I've got all this content, and I do this every year. As a matter of fact, I've written a book a year for the past 7 years, if you can believe that.
Wow. That's amazing.
But this process of emergence is that this divine intelligence, as I understand it, is constantly speaking to us through us. And it is our responsibility to access, tap into, whatever, listen to that divine intelligence that's wanting to express through us as us. And that sounds like how you come about your poems. Divine intelligence, just boom, it just emerges from you.
Yeah, so you're probably right, because and that does make sense. So one of the tricks that I picked up some years ago as part of helping people with their own storytelling was something I picked up from a woman called Julia Cameron, who wrote The Artist's Way in the 90s. And she had this thing called morning pages, where it was basically one of the most fundamental exercises for encouraging creativity. And you would just wake up in the morning and just write whatever came to mind for 3 pages, and whatever came to mind didn't have to make sense, right? So because our narrative mind, the storytelling mind, wants to weave everything into a nice narrative, and she says, look, just dump whatever comes to mind. If you need to use a toilet, do that. And when I wrote my novel, which I started writing in 2016, I was doing that exercise, and it worked so well. So I then started to realize that there was a sweet spot there. I even think Isaac Newton used to, when he was trying to solve problems, he would even sleep with a book on his head, and he'd sit in a chair because he realized there was a sweet spot in that twilight space between sleep and wake where a lot of his answers would come. And he thought, well, how can I harness this? So he slept with a book on his head, and then anytime he sort of nodded off, the book would fall, it would wake him up, and then he would write down whatever came to mind when he was trying to solve a problem.
Oh, wow.
Of course, we know there's these meditation techniques now where they actually sleep deprive deliberately and meditate at that time of the night. So there are all kinds of ways of people trying to harness this sweet spot between sleep and wake, this twilight space.
Yeah.
But interestingly, I think is also, of course, the bridge between the unconscious and the conscious is most active at that time. So we can pull a lot of resource from the unconscious, but also there's something about being empty as well. Yeah. I wrote a poem when I was on a retreat last month, a silent retreat, and I was sitting outside in this field in the countryside, and it was a full moon that weekend, and it was just before Christmas, and a whole poem just downloaded into my head, like there on the spot. And I've actually since published it on my channel. Actually, it's come out yesterday. It's called An Illusion of Shadows. That poem I wrote in an instant thought. I was sitting out in a field. It was very cold outside, frosty, and I had my hat, I had my hood, I had everything put up, I had my gloves on, and I was just looking at the moon. Now I'm on a silent retreat. There's absolutely nothing else to do. So, there's nothing to rush to. There's no books, there's no stimulus, there's no conversation, there's nothing. So you're really genuinely empty. And I'm just sitting there, and I probably sat there for hours. All kinds of different things were going on. And then this one story story poem dropped into my head, like my body or wherever it dropped. It just went, and and I just, when I came out, I remembered it. I didn't even have to create it. When I came back, I just wrote it and created the video. So I'm guessing that maybe that's that download that you're talking about,
Yep.
where the divine intelligence is giving you this gift.
Absolutely. That's how I see it. That's my story, and I'm going to stick to it. All right. So now, Kevin, I want to give you an opportunity now to tell people where they can find out more about you and your work and what you do. How can they find you?
Thank you so much. I really enjoy the conversation with you, and it's the second conversation, I think, or maybe third that we've had, and every time it's been good. You can find me, first and foremost, you can find me on my website, which is calvinniles.com. You can also find me on every single social media channel: LinkedIn, just Calvin Niles; Instagram, the same thing; Twitter, it's Calvin CL Niles, but I don't really use Twitter so much. Head over to calvinniles.com. Everything there is available to you. If you want to find out more about my books, my most recent novel called The Sun Rises in Eastmore, and is actually for men who are going through transformation, who are using their pain to rise up to higher consciousness. That's what the real critical story is about, but it's wrapped in mystery and intrigue. So if you want to find out more about that, everything's on my website. And that's it.
And spell out Niles just in case.
Yep. Calvin is like Calvin, and Niles is Niles, like the River Nile, but with an S on the end.
There you go. All right. So now I want to give you an opportunity for your final words of wisdom with the audience, whatever's on your heart to share.
Well, I mean, we're talking about shattering the stereotypes. So I guess my only thing I would like to ask, rather than even say, is the question is, who are you? Who are you really? And if that person, whoever it is you think you are, is that true? That's it.
Is that true? Wow. Awesome. Well, again, no accidents in the perfect universe, my brother. I'm glad we connected, and I know that there'll be many more collaborations in the future. Really looking forward to hanging out with you more. I do an annual summit every year called the Shatter the Stereotypes Empowerment Summit. I'd love to have you as a part of it next year, or this year, 2022. So I'll send you some more information about that later. But again, I just want to say thank you, brother.
Thank you so much
for who you are in the world and what you're contributing to the world.
Same to you, Michael. Much appreciated, brother.
All right, so this has been another episode of Shatter the Stereotypes, and I like to close with this. The key to your happiness is to begin your own inner transformational journey. It's been said that if you don't go within, you'll always go without. So go within, find your own truth, and awaken to who you truly are. We'll see you next episode. Take care.